The member for Indo.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to speak on the National Disability Insurance Scheme Bill 2012, and we on this side of the House stand ready to work with the government to ensure that a successful and working NDIS is delivered as soon as possible for all those in need. It's a rare event, an increasingly a rare event in parliaments across the country to consider a piece of legislation so universally supported. And that's because the NDIS is all about a fair go for those Australians who need help, who need support structures to ensure they can more fully participate in our community. And it was Deputy Speaker Winston Churchill who once said that you measure the degree of civilisation of a society by how it treats its weakest members. And it's a statement that I believe most members in this place would agree with. Providing adequate care for people with a disability is absolutely core government business. And I make this point at a time when government is larger, more intrusive, more bloated than ever before. And I'm reminded by the whole debate leading up to this bill, I'm reminded why we're actually here. We're here to protect and improve the lives of all Australians, including disabled Australians. Last year alone, there were more than 250 pieces of legislation that passed through this parliament. And in many cases, those bills will have the effect of increased regulation and limiting freedom. The pursuit of freedom is something that many opposite place less degree of importance that we do on this side of the House. But that pursuit of freedom, both in a personal and a community sense, is ingrained in the DNA of the opposition. And the bill before us today is unusual in that it will actually increase the size of government, and it will most certainly increase government expenditure. But at its core, this bill will have the effect of dramatically increasing the freedom from so many people in this country who suffer from a disability, and in fact dramatically increase the freedom of their carers. And it's no small thing. In 2009, 3.5 million Australians were reported as having a specific limitation or restriction. About 1.3 million people had a profound or severe core activity limitation. There's a huge section of our society whose daily freedoms are restricted through no fault of their own. And if there is anything we can as national legislators do to improve the freedoms and daily lives of a large portion of our society, then we should do whatever we can in order to achieve this. And I want to briefly go over some statistics that help paint a picture of disability in Australia. And those figures were presented in a PricewaterhouseCoopers report a little over a year ago. The report notes that people with a disability in this country are some 50% less likely to be employed than those without a disability. And beyond that fact, that a lack of employment obviously leads to a financial stress, obviously has an impact on a person's freedom, their confidence, their living standard, and their ability to pursue other lifelong objectives. For someone who's recently acquired a disability, the loss of employment often has a more dramatic result. Often we see a rapid downward spiral in that instance. So it is imperative that we do everything we can in this place to enhance the opportunity of people with a disability to seek and to gain and to retain employment. And the next statistic is shocking, particularly when you compare the figure with other comparable, relatively speaking, wealthy nations like our own. And when 45% of Australians with a disability live in poverty, you realise how grim the figures are. This is more than 2.5 times the rate of poverty experienced in the general population and more than twice the OECD average, which is 22%. And on this issue, we rank a lowly 21st out of 29 OECD countries. And when we look at other OECD figures, we see the OECD average for relative poverty risk is approximately 1.6%, and 1.6, which means that those with a disability have a poverty risk 1.6 times higher than those without a disability. And Australia has a relative poverty risk of 2.7, making us by far the worst performer in the OECD. These figures are grim and should give all of us a reason to pause and think. Now, it would be naive to suggest that the NDIS will be the answer to all our problems. It won't be. And it's important that we don't present this program as some type of magical cure, some type of panacea. Indeed, one of the authors of the PricewaterhouseCoopers report that I referred to earlier said the NDIS could help drive greater workforce and community participation for those with disabilities, but only if it was accompanied by a broader cultural shift. And went on to say, and that without other things happening, an NDIS won't deliver its full potential. If kids with disability can't get into education or access transport to get to a job, we'll continue to fall further behind even with an NDIS. Now, the PricewaterhouseCoopers report suggested that the implementation of an NDIS could support an additional 370,000 people with disabilities into the workforce by 2050, and an additional 80,000 carers could also enter the workforce as they're freed up from their daily responsibilities of caring. Now, this is terrific, but let's not forget that if there are around 4.5 million Australians who suffer from one form of disability, and if a large proportion of those people are already living below the poverty line, then we can't expect an NDIS to make all problems in this space go away, and certainly not overnight by some miraculous stroke of the pen. This is a very important scheme, but it would be foolish of us to raise expectations to the point where the inevitable reaction by the Australian community is one of disappointment. Deputy Speaker, having said all of that, the Coalition obviously approaches this bill in the most constructive spirit possible. We supported the initial work by the Productivity Commission. We supported the $1 billion in the budget last year. We supported the 5 launch sites. We support this legislation because we want the NDIS to be a success, and we will support measures in the months ahead to ensure that we get a robust and a workable NDIS, because it is servicing our community. And I want to take this opportunity in closing to thank all of those parents in my electorate who took the time over the last few years to come and see me and relate their very personal stories, very painfully and very emotionally at times, to me, and I know many of their fellow carers have done the same with my colleagues on this side of the House and obviously with members of the government. And they need to be given particular credit. Without them taking the time out of their very important commitments for caring for family members, without their persistence and perseverance and humanising, giving the issue of disability care and disability services a very real and human aspect, I suspect we may not have reached this point at this particular time. So I want to thank and acknowledge their contribution in standing up and demanding of government what they need, what their families need, and what any civilised society ought to provide in order to give those in our community with the disability and their carers the freedom to more fully participate in our society.